Welcome to a journey through the hushed corridors of time, where parchment whispers its secrets and the weight of centuries rests gently upon ancient shelves. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful exploration of humanity's greatest repositories of knowledge, those sacred spaces where civilization chose to gather its most precious thoughts, dreams, and discoveries. Let your mind drift with me now, back through the mists of history, to walk among the scholars and scribes who dedicated their lives to preserving the wisdom of ages past. In the warm Mediterranean breeze of ancient Alexandria, where the Nile meets the sea, there once stood a monument to human curiosity that would echo through millennia. The Great Library of Alexandria was not merely a building filled with scrolls, but rather a living, breathing organism of knowledge, pulsing with the intellectual heartbeat of the ancient world. Picture, if you will, the soft morning light filtering through high windows, illuminating countless papyrus scrolls, each one holding stories, mathematics, poetry, or philosophy that had traveled from the far corners of the known world to find sanctuary in this remarkable place. The library's creation was itself a gentle revolution in human thought. When Alexander the Great's general, Ptolemy I Soter, established his dynasty in Egypt around 305 BCE, he brought with him a vision that extended far beyond military conquest. Perhaps influenced by his time studying under Aristotle alongside Alexander, Ptolemy understood that true power lay not just in controlling lands, but in gathering and preserving knowledge. And so, in this city named for his former commander, he planted the seeds of what would become humanity's first attempt at a universal library. Let us imagine walking through those ancient halls in their prime. The air would have carried the distinctive scent of papyrus, that sweet, earthy aroma of pressed reed fibers, mingling with the oils used to preserve the scrolls and the ink made from soot and gum Arabic. Scholars from Athens, Jerusalem, Babylon, and Rome would have brushed past each other in the corridors, their robes rustling softly, each carrying texts in different languages, their conversations a gentle babble of Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, and Persian. The librarians of Alexandria were themselves remarkable figures, chosen not merely as caretakers, but as active participants in the expansion of human knowledge. The position of head librarian was one of immense prestige, often held by individuals who were renowned scholars in their own right. Consider Eratosthenes, who served as head librarian in the 3rd century BCE. While tending to the collection, he calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy, using nothing more than shadows, footsteps, and careful observation. Picture him in the library's gardens, perhaps taking a break from cataloging to observe the angle of shadows at noon, his mind working through calculations that would not be improved upon for over 1,000 years. The library's collection grew through methods both scholarly and audacious. Ships entering Alexandria's busy harbor were required to surrender any books they carried for copying. Scribes would work tirelessly to duplicate these texts, though sometimes, in a twist of ancient academic piracy, the library would keep the originals and return the copies to their owners. This gentle theft of knowledge was justified by the belief that preserving these works transcended individual ownership. Every text was considered a gift to future generations, a thread in the great tapestry of human understanding. Among the scrolls that lined the shelves were works that would shape civilization for millennia to come. Homer's epics were there, of course, carefully preserved in multiple copies, each variant treasured for the subtle differences that might reveal something about the poem's ancient origins. The mathematical works of Euclid found their home here, his elements becoming the foundation for geometric understanding that would persist as a standard text for over 2,000 years. Medical texts from across the Mediterranean world were collected and compared, creating a synthesis of healing knowledge that combined Egyptian traditional medicine with Greek theoretical frameworks and practical observations from lands as far away as India. But let us turn our attention now to the quieter stories, the daily life that animated these halls of learning. In the early morning hours, before the heat of the day made concentration difficult, young scribes would arrive to begin their work. These were not mere copyists, but educated individuals who understood the languages they worked with, capable of catching errors and sometimes adding their own marginal notes that would become part of the manuscript tradition. They would sit at angled desks, reed pens in hand, carefully forming each letter with practiced precision. The scratch of pen on papyrus would have created a gentle rhythm, like rain on leaves, filling the copying rooms with the sound of knowledge being preserved. The process of creating a single book was an act of devotion that could take months. First, the papyrus had to be prepared, sheets carefully glued together to create rolls that could extend for dozens of feet. The ink had to be mixed fresh each day, the proportions exact to ensure it would neither fade too quickly nor eat through the delicate papyrus fibers. The scribe would then begin the slow, methodical process of copying, checking each word against the original, maintaining consistent spacing and letter forms that would allow future readers to navigate the text easily. In the reading rooms, scholars would unroll scrolls with careful hands, weighing down the edges with smooth stones to keep them flat. Reading in the ancient world was often a communal activity, with texts read aloud even in private study. The library would have hummed with the low murmur of voices, each scholar sounding out the words, letting the rhythm of ancient poetry or the logic of philosophical arguments fill the air. This oral dimension of reading connected the scholars directly to the authors, bridging centuries through the medium of voice. The Library of Alexandria was part of a larger complex known as the Mouseion, or Shrine of the Muses. This was not just a repository but a research institution, perhaps the world's first university in the modern sense. Scholars who worked there received stipends from the royal treasury, free meals, and accommodation, allowing them to dedicate their lives entirely to learning and teaching. They conducted experiments in the gardens, observed the stars from the roof, and engaged in philosophical debates in the covered walkways that protected them from the Egyptian sun. Let us pause to consider some of the texts that were lost when the library eventually declined. The complete works of Sappho, the great poet of Lesbos, were once housed here. Today, we have only fragments of her poetry, beautiful broken pieces that hint at the full magnificence of her work. Imagine what it would be like to read her complete poems, to understand fully the mind of a woman writing in the 6th century BCE about love, loss, and the beauty of the natural world. The library held the complete histories of Berossus, a Babylonian priest who wrote in Greek about the ancient history of Mesopotamia, texts that would have provided invaluable insights into one of humanity's oldest civilizations. The decline of the Great Library was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow dimming of light that took place over centuries. Political upheavals, changes in funding, the rise of competing centers of learning, and shifting cultural values all played their part. By the time the library finally ceased to function, perhaps in the 3rd or 4th century CE, much of its collection had already been dispersed, copied, or moved to other locations. The last scholars would have worked among increasingly empty shelves, perhaps feeling the weight of endings, the quiet sadness of a great institution slowly fading into memory. Yet even as Alexandria's light dimmed, other flames of knowledge were being kindled across the ancient world. Let us journey now to Pergamon, in what is now modern Turkey, where another great library rose to rival Alexandria. The Library of Pergamon was built into a hillside, its reading rooms designed to protect the precious parchments from humidity and light. Here, necessity became the mother of invention when the Ptolemaic dynasty, jealous of Pergamon's growing collection, banned the export of papyrus to the city. The scholars of Pergamon responded by perfecting the use of parchment, treated animal skin that was more durable than papyrus and could be written on both sides. The rivalry between Alexandria and Pergamon was a gentle one, fought not with swords but with scholarship. Each library sent agents across the known world to seek out rare texts, sometimes bidding against each other for the same manuscripts. This competition drove both institutions to greater heights, pushing the boundaries of what a library could be. Pergamon developed new methods of organizing knowledge, creating some of the first subject-based cataloging systems that would influence library science for centuries to come. Moving eastward in our journey, we find ourselves in the great libraries of ancient Mesopotamia, where the very concept of the library was perhaps first born. In Nineveh, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal created a library in the 7th century BCE that was revolutionary in its scope and ambition. Unlike the papyrus and parchment of the Mediterranean world, the texts here were inscribed on clay tablets in cuneiform script, making them far more durable than their organic counterparts. Today, thousands of these tablets survive, giving us an extraordinarily complete picture of what an ancient Near Eastern library contained. Ashurbanipal was himself literate, a rarity among rulers of his time, and took a personal interest in his collection. He sent scribes throughout his empire with specific instructions to copy texts relating to all aspects of human knowledge. The resulting library contained everything from epic literature, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, to practical texts on medicine, agriculture, and law. Administrative documents sat alongside religious rituals, astronomical observations nestled next to commercial contracts. This was not just a royal vanity project, but a comprehensive attempt to gather all of human knowledge under one roof. The clay tablets of Ashurbanipal's library tell us stories that papyrus and parchment cannot. Because clay is so durable, we have tablets that show the learning process itself, practice tablets where student scribes copied the same text over and over, their skills improving with each attempt. We can see where teachers made corrections, where students added personal notes, where someone doodled in the margins during a particularly boring lesson. These small, human touches bring the ancient library to vivid life, reminding us that these were spaces inhabited by real people with all their frustrations, achievements, and moments of distraction. Let us consider the physical space of these ancient Mesopotamian libraries. The tablets were stored in wooden shelves or clay containers, organized by subject and sometimes by the first line of text, an ancient precursor to alphabetical ordering. The rooms would have been cool and dry, designed to protect the tablets from the extreme heat of the Mesopotamian sun. Scribes would work at low tables, kneeling or sitting cross-legged, pressing their reed styluses into soft clay tablets that would later be baked hard in kilns. The silence would be broken only by the soft sound of clay being shaped and the occasional crack of a tablet being fired. Now, let our minds travel south along the Nile, deep into the heart of Africa, where we find library traditions that developed independently from those of the Mediterranean and Near East. In the temples of ancient Egypt, houses of life served as combination libraries, schools, and scriptoriums. These institutions, known as parank in Egyptian, were where the sacred texts were kept and copied, where young scribes learned their craft, and where the wisdom of thousands of years was preserved in hieroglyphic, hieratic, and later demotic scripts. The House of Life at Edfu, dedicated to the god Horus, gives us perhaps our best understanding of these institutions. The walls of the temple itself became a library, covered in hieroglyphic texts that preserved religious rituals, medical knowledge, and astronomical observations. Imagine walking through these corridors, the walls speaking to you in the ancient picture writing, every surface a page in an enormous stone book. The priests who maintained these houses of life were not just religious figures, but scholars and scientists, observing the stars to maintain the calendar, studying the human body to advance medicine, and preserving the stories and wisdom of their ancestors. The Egyptian approach to preserving knowledge was unique in its integration of text and architecture. Temples, tombs, and monuments became libraries in stone, their walls inscribed with texts that would outlast any papyrus scroll. The pyramid texts, carved into the walls of pyramids from the 5th dynasty onward, represent some of the oldest religious literature in the world, preserved not on fragile organic material, but in the living rock itself. These texts were not meant for casual reading, but were positioned to be eternal, to speak their truths long after the civilization that created them had passed into memory. As we continue our journey through the ancient world, we must pause to acknowledge the libraries we know existed, but about which we have only fragments of information. The Lyceum of Aristotle in Athens housed a significant collection that influenced the development of the Alexandria Library. The Temple of Apollo at Delphi maintained archives of prophecies and dedications that spanned centuries. In Rome, private libraries became symbols of culture and status, with wealthy Romans competing to build the most comprehensive collections. But now, let us turn our attention to a part of the library story that has often been overlooked but is no less remarkable: the great libraries of Timbuktu and the African manuscript tradition. Rising from the edge of the Sahara Desert, Timbuktu became, by the 14th century, one of the great centers of learning in the world. The The libraries of Timbuktu challenge our preconceptions about where knowledge flourished and remind us that the preservation of human wisdom has always been a global endeavor. The manuscripts of Timbuktu were not printed books, but handwritten texts, each one a unique work of art. Written primarily in Arabic, but also in local languages using Arabic script, these manuscripts covered every conceivable subject. There were works on mathematics and astronomy, texts on Islamic law and theology, poetry and literature, historical chronicles, and practical guides to everything from agriculture to conflict resolution. The margins of these texts often contained additional notes in Fulani, Songhai, and other African languages, creating multilingual documents that reflected the cosmopolitan nature of Timbuktu society. The creation of these manuscripts was a family affair. Certain families became known for their scribal traditions, passing down not just the skill of writing, but also particular styles of calligraphy and illumination from generation to generation. The Cady family, for instance, maintained a library that had been in their possession since the 15th century. Picture a young scribe of the Cady family, learning at their parents' knee, practicing the formation of letters, mixing inks from local materials, learning how to prepare the paper that had traveled thousands of miles from the mills of the Islamic world or was made locally from plant fibers. The climate of Timbuktu presented unique challenges for preservation. The extremes of temperature between day and night, the ever-present threat of sand and dust, and the occasional flooding of the Niger River all posed dangers to the fragile manuscripts. Families developed ingenious methods of protection, wrapping texts in leather, storing them in wooden boxes sealed with mud, and sometimes burying them in the desert during times of political upheaval. The dedication of these families to preserving their manuscripts through centuries of change speaks to a deep understanding of the value of knowledge and a commitment to ensuring its survival for future generations. The libraries of Timbuktu were not isolated institutions, but part of a network of learning that stretched across the Sahara and connected sub-Saharan Africa with the Mediterranean world and beyond. Scholars would travel thousands of miles to study particular texts or with specific teachers. The famous Sankore Mosque and University drew students from across West Africa and the Islamic world. The sound of scholarly debate would have filled the courtyards, multiple languages mixing as students and teachers explored questions of philosophy, law, science, and literature. Among the most precious manuscripts in Timbuktu are the historical chronicles that provide African perspectives on world events. The Tariq al-Sudan and the Tariq al-Fatish offer detailed accounts of the great empires of West Africa, providing narratives that counter the often externally imposed histories of the continent. These texts remind us that libraries are not neutral spaces, but actively shape how we understand our past and, consequently, our present and future. Let us pause here to consider the quiet heroes of our story, the librarians, scribes, and families who dedicated their lives to preserving knowledge. These were individuals who understood that they were guardians of something greater than themselves, that the texts they protected were bridges between past and future, holding wisdom that might lie dormant for generations before finding the reader who needed it most. In ancient China, another great tradition of libraries and knowledge preservation was developing along its own unique path. The imperial libraries of China were vast enterprises, employing thousands of scholars and scribes. The Han Dynasty's imperial library, established in the 2nd century BCE, was organized into distinct sections for classics, philosophy, poetry, military works, mathematics and astronomy, and medicine. The Chinese approach to library organization would influence East Asian library traditions for millennia. The Chinese invention of paper in the 2nd century CE revolutionized the preservation of knowledge. Where Mediterranean and Near Eastern libraries struggled with the fragility of papyrus and the expense of parchment, Chinese libraries could produce texts on paper that was both durable and relatively inexpensive. This technological advantage allowed for the creation of larger libraries and the wider distribution of texts throughout Chinese society. The work of Chinese librarians extended beyond mere preservation to active scholarship. They compiled encyclopedias that attempted to organize all knowledge into systematic categories, created annotated editions of classic texts that preserved centuries of scholarly commentary, and developed sophisticated systems for tracking the provenance and authenticity of manuscripts. The respect accorded to librarians in Chinese society reflected an understanding that they were not just keepers of books, but guardians of civilization itself. Consider the daily routine of a scholar librarian in the Imperial Library of the Tang Dynasty, often considered the golden age of Chinese poetry and culture. Rising before dawn, they would begin their day with the careful inspection of texts, checking for signs of insect damage or decay. The morning might be spent copying a particularly fragile text on a fresh paper, each character formed with deliberate care to preserve not just the meaning but the aesthetic beauty of the original. The afternoon could be devoted to cataloging new acquisitions or corresponding with provincial libraries about rare texts. As evening fell, our librarian might join colleagues for discussions about textual variants or the proper interpretation of ancient passages, their conversations continuing long into the night by lamplight. The Chinese tradition also gave us one of the most poignant stories of knowledge preservation in the face of destruction. When the first Qin emperor ordered the burning of books in 213 BCE, scholars risked their lives to hide texts, memorize entire works, or flee with precious manuscripts. Some texts were hidden in walls, others buried in gardens, and many were preserved only in the memories of scholars who would later reconstruct them from recall. This period, though brief, left an indelible mark on Chinese intellectual culture, reinforcing the precious nature of written knowledge and the importance of its preservation. Moving across the ancient world, we encounter the great monastic libraries of India, where Buddhist and Hindu texts were preserved in institutions that combined religious devotion with scholarly pursuit. The university at Nalanda, established in the 5th century CE, housed a library so vast it was said to be divided into 3 great buildings, one of them 9 stories tall. Monks and scholars from across Asia came to study the hundreds of thousands of manuscripts housed there, texts that covered not just religious topics but medicine, logic, grammar, and the arts. The destruction of Nalanda's library in the 12th century represents one of the great catastrophes in the history of knowledge. It is said that the library burned for months, so vast was its collection. The loss was not just of texts, but of a tradition of scholarship that had developed over 7 centuries. Yet even this destruction was not complete. Scholars who fled Nalanda carried texts and, more importantly, knowledge to Tibet, Nepal, and other regions, where the tradition continued in new forms. The Tibetan monasteries that received this influx of knowledge became libraries in their own right, developing unique traditions of preservation that adapted to the harsh mountain environment. Texts were printed from wooden blocks that could produce multiple copies, ensuring that knowledge would survive even if individual manuscripts were lost. The dry, cold climate of Tibet proved ideal for preservation, and many texts that were lost in India survive today only in Tibetan translation. Let us turn now to the Islamic world's great libraries, which served as bridges between ancient and modern knowledge. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established in the 8th century CE, was not just a library, but a translation movement that brought Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic, preserving them for posterity and making them available to a new audience. Scholars at the House of Wisdom did not merely translate, but actively engaged with the texts, writing commentaries, corrections, and expansions that advanced human knowledge in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. The process of translation itself was an art that required deep knowledge of multiple languages and cultures. A single text might pass through several languages before reaching its final form, from Greek to Syriac to Arabic, or from Sanskrit to Persian to Arabic. Each translation was an act of interpretation that could introduce new insights or preserve nuances that might otherwise be lost. The translators of Baghdad were not invisible conduits, but active participants in the creation of knowledge, their marginal notes and commentary becoming part of the textual tradition. The paper mills of Baghdad, using technology learned from Chinese prisoners of war, allowed for an explosion in book production. Where a single parchment codex might cost as much as a house, paper books could be produced for the price of a good meal. This democratization of knowledge led to the proliferation of private libraries throughout the Islamic world. Merchants, doctors, and even moderately wealthy artisans could afford to build personal collections, creating a culture where book ownership was a mark of cultivation rather than extreme wealth. In Córdoba, the capital of Islamic Spain, the Caliph Al-Hakam II built a library that reportedly contained 400,000 volumes, a number that dwarfs even modern university libraries. The catalog alone ran to 44 volumes. Al-Hakam employed agents throughout the Islamic world and beyond to acquire texts, and he personally annotated many of the books in his collection. His marginalia provide us with insights into the reading practices of medieval Islamic scholars, showing how they engaged critically with texts, cross-referencing between works, and adding their own observations. The libraries of Islamic Spain were notable for their openness to scholars of all backgrounds. Christian and Jewish scholars worked alongside Muslims, creating an intellectual environment where knowledge transcended religious boundaries. This cosmopolitan approach to learning would later influence the European Renaissance, as texts preserved and developed in Islamic libraries made their way into Latin translation. The quiet moments in these libraries were filled with the rustle of paper, the scratch of pens, and the soft murmur of scholars reading aloud. The Islamic tradition of reading emphasized the musicality of language, especially in poetry and religious texts. Libraries would have resonated with the rhythmic cadences of Arabic verse, the logical progressions of philosophical arguments, and the precise language of mathematical proofs. Let us now explore the medieval European monastic libraries, where knowledge was preserved through centuries often described as dark, but which were, in reality, illuminated by the patient work of countless scribes. In monasteries from Ireland to Italy, monks dedicated their lives to copying texts, creating illuminated manuscripts that were works of art as much as repositories of knowledge. The scriptoriums of medieval monasteries were places of intense discipline and devotion. Monks would work in silence, communicating only through a system of hand signals when necessary. The only sounds would be the scratch of quills on parchment, the occasional turning of pages, and the bells that marked the canonical hours. In winter, scribes would work with numbed fingers, as fires were rarely allowed near the precious manuscripts. In summer, they battled insects attracted to the organic materials of their craft. The process of creating an illuminated manuscript was a collaboration between multiple specialists. The parchment maker would prepare the animal skins, stretching and scraping them to create a smooth writing surface. The scribe would carefully rule the pages and copy the text, leaving spaces for decorations. The illuminator would then add decorated initials, borders, and miniature paintings using pigments made from precious materials: gold leaf, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, vermilion from Spain. The bookbinder would finally assemble the pages, sewing them together and creating covers that might be decorated with jewels, ivory, or metalwork. Each manuscript was unique, bearing the personality of its creators. Scribes would sometimes add personal notes in the margins, complaints about the cold, prayers for patience, or joy at completing a particularly difficult section. One Irish monk, working in the 9th century, wrote in the margin of his manuscript about his cat Pangur Bon, comparing his own hunt for meaning in ancient texts to his cat's hunt for mice. These human touches remind us that the preservation of knowledge has always been a deeply personal act, carried out by individuals who found meaning and purpose in their work. The medieval period also saw the development of new technologies for organizing and accessing knowledge. The invention of alphabetical indexing, tables of contents, and consistent pagination made texts easier to navigate. The shift from the continuous scroll to the codex, the bound book, allowed for random access to information, fundamentally changing how readers interacted with texts. These innovations, developed in monastic libraries, would lay the groundwork for the information systems we use today. Universities began to establish their own libraries, distinct from but often connected to monastic collections. The library at the University of Paris, the Sorbonne, developed a system of chained books that allowed students to access texts while preventing theft. Picture a medieval student, perhaps studying by candlelight, turning the heavy pages of a chained book, the metal links clanking softly with each movement. These chains, which might seem restrictive to modern eyes, actually represented a democratization of knowledge, making texts available to those who could never afford to own them. The rise of universities created a new demand for books and a new economy around their production. Professional scribes set up workshops in university towns, producing textbooks for students. The Picius system developed, where authorized copies of textbooks were divided into sections that could be rented to scribes for copying, allowing for the rapid production of multiple copies while maintaining textual accuracy. This was an early form of mass production that anticipated the printing press by centuries. As we move through the medieval period, we must acknowledge the libraries of the Byzantine Empire, which preserved Greek texts that were lost in the West. Constantinople's imperial library maintained works of ancient Greek literature, science, and philosophy through centuries when these texts were unavailable in Western Europe. Byzantine scribes developed a minuscule script that allowed more text to fit on each page, making books more portable and less expensive to produce. The Byzantine approach to library organization was sophisticated, with catalogs that not only listed titles but provided brief descriptions of contents, allowing scholars to identify relevant texts without having to examine each manuscript. Libraries were often attached to hospitals and schools, creating integrated centers of learning where theoretical knowledge could be immediately applied to practical problems. Now, let us venture into the pre-Columbian Americas, where different traditions of knowledge preservation developed independently. The Maya created books from bark paper, called codices, that contained astronomical observations, religious texts, and historical records. Only 4 of these codices survive today, tragic remnants of libraries that once contained thousands of volumes. The Spanish conquest resulted in the systematic destruction of Maya books, deemed heretical by religious authorities who could not read them and feared their power. Yet knowledge preservation in the Americas was not limited to written texts. The Inca used a system of knotted cords called quipu to record information. While we often think of libraries as collections of written texts, the quipu remind us that knowledge can be encoded in many forms. These collections of quipu were maintained by specialists called quipikamaic, who were essentially librarians of a non-written tradition. They could read the knots like texts, extracting information about census data, tax obligations, and possibly even historical narratives. The oral traditions of indigenous peoples throughout the Americas also represent a form of library, with designated storytellers serving as living repositories of cultural knowledge. These individuals underwent years of training to memorize vast corpuses of stories, songs, genealogies, and practical knowledge. The destruction of these oral traditions through colonization represents a loss of libraries as significant as the burning of any building full of books. Returning to the written tradition, let us consider the development of personal libraries in the Renaissance. As wealth increased and printing made books more affordable, merchants and professionals began to build private collections. These libraries were not just displays of wealth, but working collections, used for business, education, and pleasure. The ideal Renaissance man was expected to be familiar with classical texts, contemporary literature, and practical works on subjects from architecture to zoology. The private library of Michel de Montaigne offers us an intimate glimpse into how a Renaissance scholar interacted with his books. In his tower library, Montaigne had painted quotes from classical authors on the ceiling beams, creating a space where he was literally surrounded by wisdom. He annotated his books extensively, carrying on conversations with authors across centuries. His essays, which inaugurated a new literary form, were essentially the fruits of his library browsing, weaving together quotes and ideas from his vast reading into personal reflections on the human condition. The invention of printing in the 15th century transformed libraries in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from our current perspective. Suddenly, identical copies of texts could be produced in hundreds or thousands, ensuring that knowledge would survive even catastrophic losses. Libraries could be built more quickly and cheaply than ever before. But printing also created new challenges. The sheer volume of printed material meant that libraries needed new systems of organization and new criteria for selection. Early printed books often imitated manuscripts, complete with hand-painted illuminations and Gothic script that mimicked handwriting. Gradually, printing developed its own aesthetic, with clearer typefaces, standardized layouts, and systematic use of title pages, indexes, and marginal notes. Libraries had to adapt to these new formats, developing new shelving systems and catalogs that could handle the explosion of available texts. The great libraries of the early modern period, such as the Bodleian Library at Oxford or the Vatican Library, combined medieval manuscripts with printed books, creating bridges between old and new forms of knowledge. Scholars could compare manuscript variants with printed editions, tracing the evolution of text through centuries of copying and editing. These libraries became laboratories for the new science of philology, the study of textual transmission and authenticity. Let us pause to consider the sensory experience of these early modern libraries. The smell would have been rich and complex. Old leather bindings, the vanilla scent of aging paper, the mustiness of parchment, perhaps a hint of the herbs used to discourage bookworms. The lighting would have been uneven, with bright spots near windows and deep shadows in the corners. Scholars would have worked with the rhythm of natural light, their research constrained by the movement of the sun. The sounds of these libraries evolved with technology. The quiet scratch of quills gave way to the slightly louder scratch of metal pens. The soft turning of vellum pages was joined by the crisper rustle of paper. Whispered conversations in Latin, the international language of scholarship, would have been punctuated by exclamations of discovery or frustration in vernacular languages. The creak of wooden floors and shelves, the snap of closing clasps on precious volumes, the soft thud of heavy books being placed on reading stands. All these sounds created the acoustic environment of knowledge preservation. As European powers expanded across the globe, they encountered library traditions they had never imagined. In China, they found libraries that dwarfed anything in Europe. In India, they discovered texts on mathematics and astronomy that challenged European understanding. In the Americas, they encountered, and too often destroyed, alternative ways of encoding and preserving knowledge. The colonial period was marked by both the destruction of indigenous libraries and the creation of new colonial libraries that attempted to gather knowledge from around the world. The British Museum Library, later the British Library, exemplifies this colonial approach to knowledge gathering. Founded in 1753, it grew through purchase, donation, and conquest to become one of the world's largest libraries. The moral complexities of this growth cannot be ignored. Many of its most precious manuscripts were acquired through colonial exploitation, removed from their original contexts and the communities that created them. Yet the library also preserved texts that might otherwise have been lost, creating a centralized repository of human knowledge that, despite its problematic origins, has served scholars from around the world. The establishment of national libraries in the 18th and 19th centuries marked a new chapter in the library story. These institutions were conceived as repositories of national identity, preserving not just books but the documentary heritage of entire peoples. The Bibliothèque Nationale in France expanded dramatically during the Revolution, with collections confiscated from aristocrats and religious institutions, became a symbol of knowledge democratization. The Library of Congress, founded in 1800, grew from a small legislative reference collection to a universal library that attempts to collect knowledge from all nations and in all languages. These national libraries pioneered new approaches to organization and access. They developed classification systems that attempted to organize all human knowledge into logical categories. The Dewey Decimal System and the Library of Congress classification system, both products of this period, still structure how we organize information today. Card catalogs, those rows of wooden drawers filled with typed or handwritten cards, allowed readers to search for books by author, title, or subject without having to browse entire collections. Let us consider the daily life of a librarian in one of these great 19th century institutions. Their day might begin with reviewing new acquisitions, deciding how to classify and catalog works that fit no existing category. They would assist researchers, helping them navigate the increasingly complex collections. They might spend hours verifying bibliographic information, ensuring that catalog records were accurate and complete. In the evening, they might work on special projects, perhaps creating a bibliography on a particular subject or preparing an exhibition of rare manuscripts. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the professionalization of librarianship. Library schools were established, creating a cadre of trained professionals who approached library work scientifically. Melville Dewey, creator of the Dewey Decimal System, founded the first library school in 1887. These new professional librarians brought systematic approaches to collection development, preservation, and reader services. They established professional associations, journals, and standards that transformed librarianship from a gentleman's occupation into a modern profession. The public library movement of this period deserves special attention. Funded by philanthropists like Andrew Carnegie and supported by progressive reformers, public libraries were established in cities and towns around the world. These were not elite institutions, but temples of democracy, places where any citizen could access knowledge regardless of their economic status. The grand reading rooms of these libraries, with their high ceilings, long tables, and democratic mixing of social classes, became symbols of the promise of universal education. Picture a working-class reader in a Carnegie library in 1910, perhaps a recent immigrant learning English, sitting at a polished wooden table under the gentle glow of early electric lights. Around them, others are engaged in their own pursuits. A young woman researching for a school essay, an elderly man reading newspapers from his homeland, a child discovering the magic of storybooks. The library serves as a great equalizer, a place where the factory worker and the banker's son have equal access to the treasures of human knowledge. The 20th century brought unprecedented challenges and opportunities to libraries. 2 world wars resulted in the destruction of countless libraries and the dispersal of collections. The Nazis' book burnings and the Allied bombing of German cities destroyed millions of volumes. The Holocaust resulted in the destruction of centuries-old Jewish libraries and the murder of the scholars who understood their contents. Yet the century also saw remarkable efforts to protect and preserve knowledge, from the hiding of books in attics and basements to the microfilming of entire collections. The story of the Vilna Ghetto Library during World War II exemplifies both the tragedy and resilience of libraries under threat. Even as they faced deportation and death, the Jews of Vilna maintained a library, understanding that preserving their culture was an act of resistance. Librarians risked their lives to hide precious manuscripts from Nazi looters. Hermann Kruk, the ghetto librarian, kept a diary that documents the daily struggle to maintain cultural life in the face of annihilation. His words remind us that libraries are not just buildings and books, but expressions of hope for the future. The post-war period saw an explosion in library construction and collection development. Universities expanded their libraries to support growing research programs. New technologies like microfilm and later microfiche allowed libraries to collect vast amounts of material in minimal space. Photocopying revolutionized how scholars worked with texts, allowing them to build personal collections of articles and excerpts. Libraries became not just repositories, but active participants in the creation of knowledge, supporting research with increasingly sophisticated services. The development of computer technology in the latter half of the 20th century began a transformation of libraries that continues today. Online catalogs replaced card catalogs, allowing for more sophisticated searching and remote access to bibliographic information. Libraries began to collect not just printed materials but films, recordings, and eventually digital files. The role of the librarian evolved from keeper of books to information specialist, helping users navigate increasingly complex information landscapes. Yet, even as technology transformed libraries, the fundamental mission remained constant: to preserve knowledge and make it accessible to those who seek it. The digital age has brought new challenges, from the fragility of digital media to the complexity of preserving websites and social media. But it has also brought unprecedented opportunities. Digital collections can be accessed from anywhere in the world. Rare manuscripts can be digitized and shared without risking damage to originals. Machine learning can help catalog and organize collections in ways that would have been impossible for human librarians alone. Modern libraries face the challenge of serving as bridges between the analog and digital worlds. They preserve both ancient manuscripts and born digital materials. They provide access to both physical books and electronic resources. They serve users who range from scholars seeking rare manuscripts to children discovering the joy of reading. The modern librarian must be equally comfortable with medieval paleography and metadata standards, with preservation techniques for parchment and protocols for digital preservation. Let us take a moment to explore some of the great contemporary libraries and their unique approaches to preserving and sharing knowledge. The Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University houses its collection in a glass tower that filters light to protect the materials while creating an almost sacred atmosphere. Walking into the Beinecke is like entering a temple of knowledge, the soft, filtered light illuminating millions of volumes that contain the thoughts and dreams of centuries. The Library of Alexandria, rebuilt and reopened in 2002, attempts to recapture the spirit of its ancient predecessor while embracing modern technology. The new Bibliotheca Alexandrina includes not just traditional reading rooms, but a planetarium, museums, and digital archives. It represents an attempt to create a library for the 21st century that honors the past while looking toward the future. The Internet Archive, founded in 1996, represents a new kind of library, one that exists primarily in digital space. Its mission to provide universal access to all knowledge echoes the ambitions of ancient Alexandria, but its methods are thoroughly modern. The archive preserves not just texts but websites, software, audio recordings, and videos. It maintains the Wayback Machine, which allows users to see websites as they appeared in the past, preserving the ephemeral digital culture that might otherwise disappear without trace. Small, specialized libraries also play crucial roles in preserving particular aspects of human knowledge. The Leather Archives and Museum in Chicago preserves materials related to alternative sexualities that mainstream institutions might overlook or suppress. The American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Massachusetts, focuses on American history and culture before 1876, maintaining collections that allow scholars to understand the development of American society in minute detail. The Women's Library in London preserves materials documenting women's lives and achievements, ensuring that half of human experience is not lost to historical amnesia. Community archives and libraries have emerged as important sites of knowledge preservation, particularly for marginalized communities whose stories might not be preserved by mainstream institutions. These grassroots efforts, often run by volunteers with limited resources, preserve family photographs, oral histories, organizational records, and other materials that document the lives of ordinary people. They remind us that libraries are not just about preserving the knowledge of the powerful, but about ensuring that all human experiences are remembered and valued. The concept of the library has expanded beyond physical spaces to include digital repositories, seed banks, and even DNA archives. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault, sometimes called the Doomsday Vault, preserves seeds from around the world, maintaining the genetic diversity of crops in case of catastrophe. This is a library of life itself, preserving the biological knowledge encoded in DNA for future generations. Similarly, projects to preserve endangered languages through audio recordings and grammatical descriptions create libraries of linguistic diversity, ensuring that ways of understanding and describing the world are not lost when the last speakers of a language die. As we contemplate the future of libraries, we must consider both opportunities and challenges. Climate change poses physical threats to library collections, from flooding to fires to the slow deterioration caused by changing temperature and humidity patterns. Political instability and war continue to threaten libraries, as we have seen in the destruction of manuscripts in Timbuktu by extremists and the damage to libraries in conflicts from Syria to Ukraine. The digital divide means that while some have unprecedented access to information, others are excluded from digital libraries and resources. Yet there are also reasons for hope. Digitization projects are making rare materials available to scholars regardless of their location or economic resources. Collaborative cataloging projects are creating unified access to collections scattered around the world. Open access initiatives are breaking down paywalls that have restricted access to scholarly knowledge. Community libraries and makerspaces are reimagining libraries as sites not just of consumption but of creation, where people can access not just books but tools, technologies, and expertise. The COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated changes in how libraries operate, pushing rapid adoption of digital services while highlighting the continued importance of libraries as physical community spaces. Libraries have shown remarkable adaptability, offering curbside pickup, virtual programming, and expanded digital collections while maintaining their commitment to serving all members of their communities. The pandemic has reminded us that libraries are not luxuries, but essential infrastructure for democratic societies. Let us return now to those ancient libraries with which we began our journey, considering what they might teach us about the future of knowledge preservation. The Library of Alexandria reminds us of the importance of comprehensive collection and the dangers of centralization. The libraries of Timbuktu teach us about the resilience of distributed preservation and the importance of community ownership. The monastic libraries of medieval Europe show us how knowledge can be preserved through dark times by dedicated communities. The great national libraries demonstrate the power of institutional support while warning of the dangers of cultural imperialism. Throughout history, libraries have been places of quiet revolution. They have preserved dangerous ideas through periods of suppression, maintained cultural memory through conquest and colonization, and provided spaces for individuals to discover new ways of understanding themselves and their world. The student who enters a library seeking one piece of information may leave with their worldview transformed. The scholar who spends years with a particular collection may produce insights that change how we understand our past or imagine our future. The silence of libraries is not empty, but full of potential. In that quiet space, readers connect across centuries and continents. The ancient scribe who carefully copied a text could not have imagined the modern reader who would encounter their work, yet they are connected through the medium of preserved knowledge. Every library is a time machine, every book a portal to another mind, another time, another way of seeing the world. As we near the end of our journey through the hidden life of ancient libraries, let us consider the individual texts that have shaped human understanding, those particular manuscripts and books that have traveled through time to reach us. The Diamond Sutra, printed in 868 CE and discovered in the caves of the Thousand Buddhas, is the world's oldest dated printed book, a testament to the Buddhist dedication to making wisdom widely available. The Book of Kells, created in an Irish monastery around 800 CE, represents not just religious devotion, but the heights of artistic achievement possible when communities dedicate themselves to preserving and beautifying knowledge. The Codex Sinaiticus, one of the oldest surviving Christian Bibles, has a biography as dramatic as any adventure novel. Written in the 4th century, it was preserved in St. Catherine's Monastery in Egypt for over 1,000 years, survived a fire in the 18th century, was spirited away to Russia in the 19th century, and was partially sold to the British Museum in the 20th century. Today, it has been digitally reunited, with high-resolution images allowing scholars around the world to study this crucial text without handling the fragile original. Consider the journey of Aristotle's works, which survived through a remarkable chain of preservation and translation. Lost to Western Europe for centuries, they were preserved in Byzantine and Islamic libraries, translated into Arabic, commented upon by scholars like Ibn Rushd, translated from Arabic into Latin in medieval Spain, and eventually became the foundation of university education in medieval Europe. This journey reminds us that knowledge does not belong to any one culture, but is the common heritage of humanity, preserved and developed through cross-cultural exchange. The Voynich manuscript, that mysterious medieval codex written in an unknown script and filled with bizarre illustrations, reminds us that libraries preserve mysteries as well as knowledge. Despite centuries of study and the application of modern cryptographic techniques, the manuscript remains unread, a reminder that not all knowledge is immediately accessible, that libraries preserve puzzles for future generations to solve. The survival of the Dead Sea Scrolls, preserved for 2 millennia in the dry caves near Qumran, shows us that libraries can exist in the most unexpected places. These texts, hidden during a time of political upheaval, provide invaluable insights into Judaism at the time of Jesus and the development of biblical texts. Their discovery in 1947 revolutionized biblical scholarship and reminded us that the next great library discovery might be hiding in a cave, an attic, or a forgotten storeroom. The Gnostic texts discovered at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945 had been buried in the 4th century, probably by monks who disagreed with the Church's decision to suppress these alternative Christian texts. Their preservation and eventual discovery gave voice to suppressed traditions and reminded us that libraries and acts of preservation can be forms of resistance against official orthodoxies. Let us consider, too, the texts we have lost and what their absence means. The burning of the Maya codices by Spanish conquistadors destroyed centuries of astronomical observations, historical records, and cultural knowledge. We will never know what insights into mathematics, astronomy, or history were contained in those burnt pages. The destruction of the Library of Nalanda eliminated texts on Buddhist logic and philosophy that might have advanced human understanding in ways we cannot imagine. The loss of the complete works of Livy's History of Rome, of which only 35 of 142 books survive, means our understanding of Roman history is fundamentally incomplete. The destruction of most of Aristotle's dialogues, which Cicero praised for their literary beauty, means we know the philosopher only through his lecture notes, not through the polished works he intended for publication. Each lost text represents not just missing information, but lost perspectives, alternative ways of understanding the world that might have enriched human culture in ways we can never know. Yet we must also celebrate the miraculous survivals, the texts that made it through fire, flood, war, and neglect to reach us. The Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's oldest known literary work, survived on clay tablets buried in the ruins of ancient cities. Beowulf exists in a single manuscript that barely survived a fire in 1731. The only copy of the Old English poem, The Battle of Maldon, was destroyed in the same fire, but fortunately had been transcribed a few years earlier. These near misses remind us of the fragility of cultural transmission and the importance of preservation efforts. Modern technology has given us new tools for preservation, but also new challenges. Digital texts can be copied infinitely without degradation, but they can also vanish instantly if servers fail or formats become obsolete. The average website lasts less than 100 days before it changes or disappears. Social media posts, which increasingly document our lives and thoughts, are controlled by corporations that might delete them without warning. The challenge for contemporary libraries is not just preserving traditional materials, but ensuring that the digital documentary record of our time survives for future generations. Projects like the Million Book Project, which aims to digitize 1 million books and make them freely available, represent the democratic promise of digital libraries. Google Books, despite its legal controversies, has digitized millions of volumes, creating a searchable database of human knowledge that would have seemed like magic to ancient librarians. The Hathi Trust, a collaboration of academic libraries, ensures that digitized texts will be preserved even if commercial projects fail. Yet we must be careful not to let the promise of digital preservation lead to the neglect of physical collections. Original manuscripts and books carry information that cannot be captured in digital reproductions. The texture of the paper, the way ink has faded or bled, the marginal notes that might be too faint to scan, the evidence of how books were bound and rebound, all tell stories about how texts were created, transmitted, and used. The physical object carries its history in ways that digital copies cannot fully replicate. Libraries continue to evolve in response to changing needs and technologies. The rise of makerspaces in libraries, where patrons can access 3D printers, recording studios, and other creative technologies, represents a return to the ancient idea of libraries as sites of knowledge creation, not just consumption. Libraries are becoming community centers, offering everything from language classes to legal clinics, recognizing that access to information must be accompanied by the skills and support needed to use it effectively. The modern library serves many functions simultaneously. It is a quiet refuge for contemplation and study. It is a community gathering place. It is a portal to digital resources. It is a preserver of local history. It is a provider of entertainment. It is a support system for education. It is a promoter of literacy. It is a bridge across the digital divide. The librarians who manage these complex institutions must be part curator, part teacher, part social worker, part technology specialist, and part community organizer. As we contemplate the hidden life of ancient libraries and their modern descendants, we must acknowledge the emotional and spiritual dimensions of these institutions. Libraries are not just functional spaces, but places of transformation. The child who discovers reading in a public library may find not just entertainment, but a lifeline, a way to imagine different futures. The researcher who spends months with a particular collection develops an intimate relationship with the materials, coming to know the handwriting of long-dead scribes, the reading habits of previous scholars, the physical feel of different papers and bindings. Libraries hold our collective memory, but they also shape our collective imagination. The books we preserve and the ones we neglect, the voices we amplify and the ones we silence, the stories we tell and the ones we forget, all contribute to our understanding of what it means to be human. Libraries are not neutral spaces, but active participants in the construction of culture and knowledge. The decisions made by librarians, from what to acquire to how to organize collections, shape what future generations will know about us and what resources they will have to address their own challenges. The ancient library of Alexandria dreamed of universal knowledge, of gathering all human wisdom under one roof. This dream was impossible, of course, but the aspiration itself was noble. Today's libraries, networked and collaborative, may come closer to achieving this ancient dream than any single institution ever could. Through interlibrary loan, digital collections, and collaborative cataloging, the world's libraries form a distributed universal library, where knowledge preserved in a small monastery library can be accessed by a researcher on the other side of the world. Yet we must remain mindful of the inequalities that persist. While some have unprecedented access to information, others lack basic literacy or internet access. While some languages are extensively documented and preserved, others disappear without trace. While some perspectives are abundantly represented in library collections, others are marginalized or excluded. The work of creating truly inclusive libraries, ones that preserve and provide access to the full diversity of human knowledge and experience, remains unfinished. As night deepens and our journey through the hidden life of ancient libraries draws toward its close, let us sit for a moment in the imagined quiet of these sacred spaces. Picture yourself in the Library of Alexandria at twilight, the last rays of sun filtering through high windows, illuminating motes of dust that dance like tiny planets in the golden light. The day scholars have departed, and only a few dedicated readers remain, their oil lamps creating pools of warm light in the gathering darkness. Or perhaps you find yourself in a medieval monastery as the brothers file in for Compline, the last prayer service of the day. The library is dark except for the faint light from the church, and the books rest in their chains, holding their secrets until tomorrow's light returns. The silence is profound, broken only by the distant sound of chanting and the occasional creak of ancient wood adjusting to the cooling night air. Or maybe you stand in the ruins of Nalanda, where the great library once rose 9 stories into the Indian sky. The books are gone, burned centuries ago, but if you listen carefully, you might hear the echo of ancient debates, the whisper of pages turning, the scratch of styluses on palm leaves recording insights that would travel across continents and centuries. These libraries, whether surviving, transformed, or lost, remind us that the preservation of knowledge is both a practical necessity and a sacred trust. Every generation must decide what to preserve and what to let go, what to remember and what to forget. These decisions shape not just what future generations will know, but who they will become. The story of libraries is ultimately a story of hope. Despite war, disaster, neglect, and deliberate destruction, knowledge survives. Texts thought lost are rediscovered. Languages considered dead are deciphered. Ideas suppressed in one place flourish in another. The human drive to preserve and share knowledge has proven stronger than the forces that would destroy it. As we move forward into an uncertain future, libraries remain our anchors to the past and our bridges to the future. They preserve not just information but wisdom, not just facts but understanding, not just data but culture. They remind us that we are not alone, that we are part of a conversation that began before we were born and will continue after we are gone. The hidden life of ancient libraries continues in every modern library, in every act of preservation, in every moment when a reader encounters an idea that changes their understanding of the world. The torch of knowledge, first lit in those ancient halls, continues to burn, passed from hand to hand across generations, illuminating the darkness and warming those who seek its light. Tomorrow's libraries may look different from today's, just as today's differ from those of ancient Alexandria or medieval monasteries. They may exist primarily in digital space, or they may return to older models of community gathering places. They may be managed by artificial intelligences or may remain resolutely human institutions. But whatever form they take, they will continue the ancient work of preserving and sharing knowledge, ensuring that the wisdom of the past remains available to address the challenges of the future. The manuscripts of Timbuktu, saved from destruction by being buried in the desert sand, remind us that knowledge is resilient but requires active protection. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia, readable after 4,000 years, show us that with the right medium and conditions, knowledge can survive almost indefinitely. The digital archives being created today, with their promise of infinite reproduction and global access, offer new possibilities for preservation and sharing that ancient librarians could scarcely have imagined. Each library, whether it contains 1,000,000 volumes or a few dozen, whether it serves a global audience or a small community, participates in this grand project of human knowledge preservation. The school library that introduces a child to reading, the academic library that supports groundbreaking research, the public library that provides internet access to job seekers, the special collection that preserves rare manuscripts, all are part of the same tradition that began when humans first decided that some knowledge was too important to be forgotten. As we prepare to leave these quiet halls of memory and return to the noise and urgency of our daily lives, let us carry with us some of the peace and purpose of the library. Let us remember that we are all temporary custodians of knowledge, responsible for preserving what we have inherited and contributing what we can to the great conversation of humanity. The books that surround us in libraries are not dead objects, but living voices, waiting patiently to share their secrets with anyone who will listen. The librarians who tend these collections are not mere clerks, but guardians of civilization, ensuring that the light of knowledge continues to burn even in dark times. The readers who enter these spaces seeking information may leave with something far more valuable, a new way of seeing the world, a connection to minds across centuries, a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. In the end, the hidden life of ancient libraries is not really hidden at all. It continues openly in every library, in every act of reading, in every moment when knowledge is preserved or shared. The ancient dream of gathering all human knowledge may be impossible, but the attempt itself ennobles us. The work of preservation may be endless, but it gives meaning and continuity to human existence. As sleep begins to call and our journey reaches its gentle conclusion, let us honor those who came before us, who preserved the knowledge we now take for granted. Let us thank the anonymous scribes who copied texts by candlelight, the librarians who saved collections from destruction, the families who hid manuscripts in walls and gardens, the scholars who translated works from languages they barely understood, the philanthropists who built public libraries, the technologists who digitized fragile manuscripts, and all the others who have contributed to the preservation and transmission of knowledge. And let us remember our own responsibility to this great chain of preservation. Whether we are professional librarians or simply readers, whether we work with ancient manuscripts or digital files, whether we preserve great literary works or family photographs, we all participate in the work of memory. We are all librarians of something, keepers of stories, preservers of knowledge that might otherwise be lost. The ancient libraries call to us across the centuries, reminding us of what we have lost, but also of what we have saved. They speak of the fragility of knowledge, but also its resilience. They tell us that civilizations rise and fall, but ideas endure. They whisper that in the quiet spaces between the shelves, in the gentle rustle of pages, in the soft scratch of pens on paper, something eternal is happening. The human spirit is reaching across time and space to touch another human spirit, to share what it has learned, to preserve what it values, to contribute its small part to the great library of human experience. May your dreams tonight be filled with the quiet wisdom of ancient libraries, the whisper of turning pages, the gentle light of oil lamps on vellum, the satisfaction of knowledge preserved and shared. May you wake tomorrow with a renewed appreciation for the libraries in your life, whether they are grand institutions or simple collections of beloved books. And may you remember that you, too, are part of this ancient tradition, a keeper of stories, a preserver of memories, a link in the great chain of knowledge that connects us all across time and space. As our exploration draws to its peaceful close, Let the image of those ancient libraries remain with you. The scholars bent over their texts in Alexandria, the monks illuminating manuscripts in medieval scriptoriums, the families in Timbuktu carefully wrapping their manuscripts for protection, the students in Nalanda debating philosophy in the courtyards. All of them, and all of us, united in the belief that knowledge is precious, that wisdom should be preserved, that the thoughts and dreams and discoveries of humanity are worth saving for those who come after. Sleep now, if sleep is calling, carrying with you the peaceful knowledge that somewhere, in libraries around the world, the work continues. Librarians are cataloging new acquisitions. Conservators are carefully repairing damaged manuscripts. Scholars are discovering new insights in ancient texts. Children are learning to read. Students are researching their first papers. And readers of all ages are losing themselves in books that transport them to other times and places. The hidden life of ancient libraries goes on. Not hidden at all, but happening all around us. A quiet miracle of preservation and transmission that ensures the conversation of humanity continues unbroken from the past through the present and into the future. Rest well, knowing that the knowledge of ages is safely preserved, waiting patiently on shelves both physical and digital, ready to share its secrets with anyone who seeks them. The libraries are keeping watch through the night, as they have for millennia, guardian angels of human memory, ensuring that no matter how dark the night may become, the light of knowledge will continue to shine, guiding us forward, connecting us to our past, and illuminating the path to our future.